welcome GSAR members to another edition of GNN, Greater Syracuse Association of Realtors News Network. Hi, I'm your CEO, Lynnore Fetyko. Today we'll be interviewing New York State Association of Realtors Government Affairs Director, Mike Kelly. Hi, Mike.
Hello, Lynnore. How are you?
Mike, as head staff lobbyist, can you tell us about the current political dynamic in Albany?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Lynnore. Thank you, and that's a great question. I think one thing I would probably start with is the fact that right now it's difficult to talk about government in New York State without talking about the pandemic and its impact on New York State government and New York State tax revenues. Right now, in New York, we're estimating about a $10 to $15 billion budget deficit for the current fiscal year. Governor Cuomo is projecting a $65 billion deficit over the next 4 years due to the pandemic. He has ordered his New York State Division of the Budget to amend its fiscal plan for the 2020-2021 fiscal year, and is amending that accordingly. They've already done it at least one time. State government has asked localities and school districts to try and address this by withholding 20% of state funding, and those localities and school districts are bracing for further withholding and further cuts as well. As you know, we are still waiting to see if Congress comes and the president come to an agreement about further aid to states and local governments. But absent support from Washington, state and local governments in New York State are going to be forced to make, I think, some really difficult decisions regarding cutting services, things they're providing to their constituents, to their residents, or alternatively, and maybe additionally, where to find additional revenue streams. So that's, I think, the biggest challenge facing New York State right now. In terms of the political climate, look, I think we've all seen Governor Cuomo in his, up until recently, daily briefings. The governor is experiencing record high approval ratings for its handling of the pandemic. At one point, I think he was even up to a 77% approval rating. I think it dipped slightly. It could only come down, I think, from that point to about 66% approval. But think about that, Lynnore. That's 2/3 of the New Yorkers saying, we think the governor's on the right track. His daily briefings became a must-see, not just for New Yorkers, but I think a lot of people nationwide, as we were clamoring for more clarity and information about what is government doing to assist us in the midst of the pandemic. So the legislature, I think, has been trying to find its voice. For better or for worse, Governor Cuomo has taken a lot of the oxygen out of the room via those daily briefings. And I think the legislature has several big challenges before it over the next couple months, and the governor as well.
So Mike, tell us what NYSAR's vision is for the future, 2021 and beyond.
Right now, I have probably a list of 7 or 8 things that I'm concerned about, that NYSAR is working on, that we're trying to address as we get through the end of 2020 and look towards 2021 with the legislature coming back to Albany soon. We have the potential of municipal rent control fights across New York State. So think of that from my perspective as we're in a larger war against the imposition of rent regulation across New York State, but we're fighting it on multiple fronts. So already in New York State, the city of Kingston has tried to impose rent regulation in its city. And the good news is they didn't meet the quote emergency vacancy threshold rate of 5% or less. So that issue didn't come to fruition there. But I think once we get done with the pandemic and we get through it, I think municipalities across the state are going to be looking at what ways they can help the renters, the tenants in those communities. So I think you're going to see cities like Rochester, where I know they've already begun conversations about this, Beacon, New York, and the Hudson Valley, Albany, and who knows, maybe even Syracuse, having this conversation of, do we want to have New York City style rent control in our cities? And there aren't a lot of hurdles that those municipalities have to do to impose that. So that's probably one of the bigger things that we're watching as we move into 2021. Good cause eviction is a piece of legislation that's been introduced in Albany for several years that would severely restrict the ability of a landlord to evict a tenant in only cases that are lined out per that statute. It was the one piece of the Tenant Protection Act that did not get signed into law in 2019. NYSAR strongly opposed that piece, and the good news is at the time it didn't make it into statute. Unfortunately for us, look, the tenant advocate groups aren't going anywhere, and they continue to hammer away at this issue and plead with lawmakers to impose a good cause eviction statute in New York State. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that ever continuing fight about pushing back against government, both at the local and state level, looking at real estate as a revenue stream to fill coffers. We had talked briefly about that independent contractor status issue as well. And then I guess from a legal perspective, NYSAR is engaged in two legal challenges right now: the legality of rent control in New York City, which obviously is going to have statewide impacts as the rent regulation could expand beyond New York City if municipalities want to do that. And then the legality of a Department of State interpretation with regard to fees paid by the broker, paid to the broker by tenants when renting an apartment. This is primarily a practice in New York City, but NYSAR is engaged in the lawsuit as well. So.
Got your hands full, Mike, as usual. Mike, what can we expect from the federal and state elections?
Well, I think, Lynnore, I think if the primary elections back in June taught us anything, it's that with so many people voting by absentee ballot, there are going to be many races that remain unclear long after Election Day on November 3rd. I think the June primary elections showed us that there were tremendous inroads in New York State by Democratic Socialist-backed candidates. At a minimum, we saw the defeat of at least 7 well-entrenched incumbent Democrats in the state legislature by political newcomers, backed by the Democratic Socialists and backed by the Working Families Party as well. At the federal level, these trends and these inroads made by Democratic Socialist candidates were seen as well. You saw long-serving Congressman Representative Elliot Engel from the Bronx, in office since 1989, defeated by a political newcomer in Jamal Bowman, who had the strong backing of Democratic Socialists for that Bronx and Westchester congressional seat, the 16th congressional district. Mr. Bowman is assuredly going to win at this point. It is a strong Democratic seat. Also coming out of those June primaries, we saw an 8-way Democratic primary to replace Representative Nita Lowey for that 17th congressional district in the Hudson Valley, where Mondaire Jones, again, another political newcomer, defeated multiple state lawmakers in that process, in that primary challenge, including Senator David Carlucci and Assemblyman David Buchwald. And Mr. Jones is, again, expected to cruise to victory in November. These Democratic Socialist candidates all won on platforms that current / incumbent Democrats, including Governor Cuomo, by the way, weren't doing enough for New Yorkers on issues such as single-payer health care, raising taxes on the wealthy, legalizing marijuana, furthering criminal justice reforms, combating climate change, and addressing housing justice issues like good cause eviction and cancel rent initiatives. As we look to November, I'm watching several federal races in New York State. Number one, the replacement for long-serving Congressman Pete King. You have candidates Republican Andrew Garbarino, a current assemblyman, facing off with Democratic challenger Jackie Gordon for that Long Island-based 2nd Congressional District. Upstate New York, in the Mohawk Valley, you see Anthony Brindisi versus former Congresswoman Claudia Tenney, a rematch of the election we saw 2 years ago for the 22nd Congressional District. On Staten Island, you've got Representative, current Congressperson Max Rose facing off against current Assemblywoman Nicole Maliotakis for that Staten Island, Brooklyn-based 11th Congressional District. In Western New York, you've got a rematch from the June primary election, replacing Chris Collins. So Chris Jacobs was elected to Congress back in June in an election against Democratic challenger Nate McMurray. There is now a rematch in November, and the question is, can Mr. McMurray make any inroads there or change course after his defeat in June? Is it enough to win the general election? We'll have to see. In Central New York, probably of most importance to you and your membership, Congressman John Katko defending his seat against peers, almost perennial challenger Dana Balter in that Central New York, Syracuse-based 24th Congressional District. I think that's one that a lot of people in Congress are watching, that Central New York fight. At the end of the day, I think Mr. Katko is in a pretty good place. There will be a lot of media buys. The media market in Syracuse is not as expensive as some other markets across the country, but I think that's going to be a highly contested race. I think at the state level, there's one race in particular that we at NYSAR are watching, and that's that race to fill the seat, the Senate District 50 seat, the seat formerly held by Senator John DeFrancisco for many, many years, and more recently held by Bob Antonacci, who, as you know, left to become a judge at the local level. The contestants there are Democratic candidate John Mannion, a former teacher, with strong backing by organized labor, in particular NYSAR, and Republican Angie Renna for that open seat there. So that's probably the most highly contested state race we'll be watching in Central New York.
So Mike, what are you and your team working on at NYSAR lately?
Well, lately, lately we've been working on efforts to, I guess, maintain our connections with state lawmakers, number one. We've been working through with the RPAC trustees of New York, about 21 open seats that we've been deliberating over. We've gotten through 10 last week, so it means we've got 11 or 12 to go over the next month, and the trustees have to meet and deliberate and make some decisions about where our PAC support is going to go. But I think as we look towards the remainder of 2020 and looking towards 2021, I think there are several really important things that we as a real estate trade association need to be on alert about. And I think probably in the short term, I'm most concerned with any attempts by local governments or state governments to find revenues to fill that, shortfall that we talked about earlier on the call, with a increase in a real estate related tax of some sort. So it could be a community preservation fund tax, which is a real estate transfer tax at the local level. It could be a statewide mortgage recording tax increase. It could be a increase in the real estate transfer tax. So that's probably in the short term, the thing I'm concerned about the most. The legislature is supposed to come back to Albany within the next couple of weeks. I'm not sure if that's going to come to fruition, but I think the legislatures right now is trying to figure out a way to raise revenues in the midst of this pandemic. And it's difficult to do because a lot of people aren't back working. We still have pretty high unemployment numbers, and that's a challenge to do. So I think you'll see the focus of state government putting the crosshairs on high wealth, high net worth individuals, and particularly in the downstate market as a vehicle or as a source of revenues. I don't know what that's going to look like yet. The legislature has alluded to possibly what they're looking at, which could include a increase or the imposition of a pied-à-terre tax in New York City. So that's a tax on second homes worth $5 million or more in New York City. There's also some discussion about an increase in New York State income tax rates on high net worth individuals, as well as something which I don't think probably has that much legs, but the imposition of a stock transfer tax in New York State. And I think you and our members can understand the negative impact that would have on Wall Street and New York as a whole. So those are probably some of the things in the short term that we are working on, that we're concerned about. And I should also say one thing too. In 2020, early in the year, the end of 2019, there was the beginning of a conversation about independent contractor status. And the concern we have is any attempts by government to amend or change that independent contractor status for real estate licensees. State government is looking at ways to try and improve the working and employment position for independent contractors such as Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, people that do food delivery like Grubhub, things of that nature. The good news for us is we've had multiple conversations with committee leadership in both houses, as well as Governor's Council, Governor Cuomo's council, about our concerns with that. And we do not appear, we are not the intended audience. We are not the intended target for those changes in the independent contractor status law. So we're trying to make sure that we get a carve out similar to what happened in California. So that's good news, number one. Number two is it appears that that issue has fallen to the wayside, at least in the short term, due to more, I guess, pressing concerns related to the pandemic.
So Mike, most associations build their dues billing at the beginning of the year, and members paid their RPAC contribution then. And just wondering how across the board is New York State doing with RPAC contributions? I take a look at our numbers and we are close to goal. Not there yet. My goal is to have the members contribute by the NYSAR meetings early October, so that we have met our goal. We have definitely surpassed our participation goal, which is great news for us. But across the board in New York State, how's everyone done?
Yeah, it's a great question. New York State was different, first of all, than a lot of other states in that the impact of the pandemic really hit us first more than other states. It was fascinating to watch the conversation about RPAC and RPAC solicitations and participation in events, and are you going to go to the bowling event? Are you going to be able to have another fundraiser? And our conversation in New York has been much different than the conversations my colleagues, the people that do what I do for other states. So, for example, the experience of the Nebraska realtors and RPAC was just much different than New York, right? I mean, we went into full lockdown for multiple months. We still have the inability, for the most part, to do in-person activities up to a certain amount of people. I think at this point it's still capped at 50 people. Yep. So that limits our ability to do in-person events, which have been a terrific vehicle for local boards and for New York State, frankly, to assist us in raising RPAC dollars. Our numbers are down. Our participation numbers are down, quite dramatically in New York State. Our fundraising numbers, a little bit less so. I think people that believe in RPAC, our members that believe in RPAC, that understand what RPAC does, have realized the importance of maintaining their support for the committee, for the PAC itself, and we're eternally grateful for that. We at the staff level have been really cognizant of the fact that our members for several months were not making deals. We're not
there was no
attending,
income.
Had no income. We're not attending closings. We're not doing in-person showings. And we get that, and we understood that, and we were, I said the last thing I was about to do, Lynnore, is send an email out to our realtor members asking for RPAC support when they weren't making any money. I think that would have been misguided and just a lack of understanding about who our members are and what challenges they had. That's right. So you had to be a little bit sensitive about that. I think the good news is from what I hear from our members, this is now in, mid-September, one of the hottest real estate markets that our members have, in some markets, have ever seen. So I think that's a silver lining in all of this, and knock on wood, I hope that continues. And our members at some point, if they are in a financial place where they can contribute to the PAC, will do so accordingly.
Good to hear. Mike, one last question. Can you talk a little bit about cold calling? We've gotten some calls from our members asking if it's permissible now. And just to be clear, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So there was a state law that was passed several years ago that essentially says telemarketers can't do cold calling when there is a state of emergency in place. And that was long before the current COVID pandemic. So lo and behold, we run into a COVID-19 pandemic. Governor Cuomo declares a state of emergency, appropriately so. And in conjunction with that, it then ties back to that law that was already in place that says you can't do cold calling in the midst of the pandemic. That executive order was just, that state of emergency order was just extended. I believe it was on September 6th. It was late in the evening. New York State government likes to do things, unfortunately, sometimes at the last hour. It was just extended, though, till October 4th. So that prohibition of real estate licensees from doing telemarketing or cold calling calls still exists. NYSAR counsel Anthony Gatto has got several more bullet points on how to adhere to this and specifics about the law up at NYSAR.com. So that's where, if our members wanted to get more information, that's where I would go. If you have any specific questions, you could always, obviously, our members, one of the benefits they have is being able to call the NYSAR legal hotline, and I would advise them to do that. So
absolutely. Well, Mike, on behalf of GSAR members, I'd like to thank you and your team for all the things that you do in Albany for us and your vast knowledge about what's going on the political landscape and keeping us up to date. And we hope you accomplish everything that you wanted to do for 2020, that the pandemic didn't waylay a lot of the goals that you had to make for the future of real estate in Central New York and all of New York State. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynnore. I appreciate it. And hopefully someday we'll get to do this in person again.
Again, right. GSAR members, there you have it from Mike Kelly, New York State Association of Realtors, Government Affairs Director, and thank you for watching.